So today's panel is being moderated by Doug Herbert, who is with us once again this year, and has been deeply involved in helping us craft this panel. Doug is the supervisor of the Arts and Education Programs in the Office of Innovation and Improvement at the U.S. Department of Education. Joining Doug are three key voices that are very important to this topic. Senator David Sokola from Delaware, Allison Knox, who's the Director of Education Policy and Programs at Microsoft, and Dave Ross, the CEO of the Partnership for the 21st Century Learning. Please join me in welcoming them all. And Doug, I thank you for moderating the session.
You're fantastic. Did you take your pictures?
Yes, yeah, I did.
Well, we have to take
Very
a
good.
picture.
Give me a second to put this transmitter back on here with a little
Okay, all right.
technical
I have to go take my mic off.
malfunction. Abby, I want to say to you that you're a proverbial hard act to follow. Let me just say that. And I'm so proud that Abby, my kids spent some time in the schools in Frederick County, some of the very same schools that Abby went to, and I'm just so pleased to make her acquaintance and know that I have a little bit of contact with her past, and just she's on a great path, and again, a hard act to follow. And I'll tell you why here. We are talking about the workforce of tomorrow, and I'll keep that in mind because when we had our conversation on the phone, we aren't talking necessarily about what's going to happen to Abby next year when she graduates from Middletown High School. We're talking about 10 years out for the kids who are now in elementary school, the generation, whatever they're going to be after Z. So keep that in mind. But what came to mind for me as we talked about the content of today's panel was a quote from Thomas Friedman from The World is Flat from a few years ago. And he said, and I quote, "Liberal arts are more important than ever and must be a priority because this is where and how so much innovation happens." And he added, "It's not that I don't think math and science, engineering for that matter, I'll put in there, are important," Friedman said. "They still are, but more than ever, our secret sauce comes from our ability to integrate art, science, music, and literature with the hard sciences." And I would say you echoed that, Abby, beautifully by talking about those multiple intelligences that engineers and artists share and should bring together as Friedman sees it. I'm reminded, though, in this secret sauce, the other metaphor I heard yesterday that was absolutely wonderful, in the Prince George's County session on their arts integration project, Maria Barboza had a great metaphor. She said, arts integration, to be done right, is a jelly roll. So the jelly is the art, and the roll is the STEM subjects and the other subjects that are not the arts, right? So you can't really take the jelly, the art, out and actually have a jelly roll. Keep that in mind. On the other hand, art enhancement, where you're not really integrating, is like a cupcake with some really nice icing. You can take the icing away and you still have a cupcake. So I think that there's a great metaphor there for what Friedman is saying is you have to have these things working integrally rather together. The new Every Student Succeeds Act makes the arts essential in the way that it crafts the well-rounded education. The arts and music are in there. But how that's going to play out in terms of what it looks like in states and more importantly in schools and districts is going to be decided by policymakers who are going to be thinking about the subject we're going to discuss here for 60 minutes, which is what are the skills that kids are going to need to be successful in careers that we can't even identify today, and workplaces are going to constantly be changing because of technology and digitization. According to a recent survey of American business executives, which is highlighted in the blog that came out today from AEP, nearly half of those business executives think that Americans lack the skills most needed for success, and they identified those as communication, creativity, collaboration, and critical thinking. The Partnership for 21st Century Skills, joining us today is Dave, its director, has been focused on those skills for nearly as long as the Arts Education Partnership has been putting forth the advocacy, not the advocacy, but the research for the advocacy about the importance of arts for school success, success in work, and success in life. 4 years ago, in fact, AEP presented research supporting the arts role in preparing students for success in school, work, and life, and a great pamphlet you can get from the website called Preparing Students for the Next America. I encourage you to get that if you don't have it already, and use the research there for the subject today, which is how the arts support students for work. The new AEP blog that I just mentioned and Jane brought to your attention, the importance of arts education and workforce preparation. You can read about that recent survey that I highlighted of the U.S. business executives. Here's some statistics from that survey. 92% of those business executives said American workers are not as skilled as they need to be. No surprise there. But nearly half of them, 44%, said that what they lacked, again, were those soft skills, not the technological skills. The three other skill categories that they were surveyed about, technical, leadership, and software, came in far behind the 44% that said it was soft skills. They came in at only 22%, 14%, and 12% respectively. The blog also offers some great resources on the arts and 21st century skills, including an employability skills framework that colleagues of mine at the U.S. Department of Education developed with some outside stakeholders. And there's also in the blog a set of resources put together by the Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives about enhancing character and soft skills in America's students. Our format today is going to be one where each of our panelists is going to talk for about 3 minutes on an opening, what we're calling a framing question. We talked about the things that they most wanted to get across in terms of some of the overarching things that we're going to be approaching today. So we'll start with that. We'll have about 25 minutes of dialogue, and we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for your questions. So I also want to mention that the two overall questions that we really want to address with our panelists today is how do we frame the importance of arts and education to audiences in the business and elected officials arenas? And the second thing we're going to be looking at is why inclusion of the arts in pre-K through 12 can better prepare students for tomorrow's economy and workplace. So let me begin by asking David, we decided it's Dave and not David for the purposes of our panel. The Partnership for 21st Century Skills we were talking about has been around since 2002. I think you have a visual for us to tell us a little bit about the partnership and where it has come from and how it goes about identifying these 21st century skills.
I was a history teacher for 10 years before I changed careers, so I need to delve a little bit into the history of the work. In 1989, the Labor Department came out with what many people know as the SCAN set of skills, which was sort of the precursor to all the work that's gone on around 21st century skills for the last couple of decades. In 2002, P21 was formed and spent the first 4 years of its life forming what is called the 21st Century Learning Framework. And at the center of the framework are two significant pieces of information. One is core knowledge and skills. And when that framework was first developed, arts was considered core knowledge. And then there was the skills piece of it, and that's drawn the most attention. And at the center of the skills piece are 4 skills, and Doug's already listed them. We call them the 4 C's, as does everybody else: creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, and communication. So shifting forward now to 2017, one of our partners, and there's several in the room like Faber-Castell and Crayola, one of our partners is Pearson. And we've been working with the learning sciences team with Pearson on delving into the true nature of what these skills are. We released a report for free on our site on collaboration in April, and in about 2 weeks we're going to release a report on critical thinking and problem solving. And we had a long discussion with the learning sciences team. Is critical thinking a skill or a set of skills? And so the analogy that I used to help myself understand it was my wife and I both love to cook, and we have a cooking skill. We have the skill of cooking, but buried within that are a subset of skills such as time management, use of tools, preparation and presentation, understanding ingredients and chemistry. And so cooking is a skill, critical thinking is a skill, but there are a subset of skills. I look the same way at art. When you look at art, it's virtually impossible art is communication. So art is a skill, but then there's the technical skills of dance or performance or drawing or digital design or whatever. But buried within that, and I shouldn't say buried, imbued within that are the skills of creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, and communication. The map that's on there was produced in 2010 with most of the organizations that are in this room as partners, and so wink, wink, if anybody wants to collaborate with us and redo this for 2017, I would love to have that particular conversation. Now, I want to migrate. Doug's already hit some of the key points of the data that supports what business, and we're funded primarily by nonprofits and for-profits who look at workforce readiness and workforce development. Doug's listed those skills. But I'll close with what I think is one of the most important reasons to focus on art. Art in and of itself is an iterative process. I defy you to go to a professional development event in any field and not hear agile manufacturing, rapid prototyping, design thinking, or failing forward or fast failing. All of that is iterative process. So if every single industry in the world is focusing on this iterative process that involves awareness of audience, informative feedback, and drafting, and producing things on time, art is the way to do that. So we have to look at it from a pedagogical standpoint. That framework is student outcomes, but there has to be enabling conditions to produce those outcomes. How do we teach it? And P21 would argue that art is the way to engender and enhance those skills. Because when you work on a theater or dance production, you are working on a project and you have to develop these skills. You have to collaborate, communicate, critically think, and problem solve.
Thank you, Dave. Allison, at Microsoft, you have a special, unique perch to look at the changes that technology are bringing to the workplace. What do you see there in terms of that factor?
Sure. Your word perch makes me feel like a bird all of a sudden. That was a joke. So one thing you should know about what I do, I think it's important to just kind of put that in context. I go around the country, and hopefully I've met some of you. I talk about the need for about 500,000 new programmers, so people who can code. So let me just put a fine point on it. I'm from Michigan, and in my state right now, there are currently 14,000 positions open with needing for a background in computer science. And we graduated in my home state, only about 2,000 students with an undergraduate degree, a master's degree, or PhD. The entry-level position for one of these jobs is about $80,000 a year, about twice the amount of the average position. And last year in our state, my home state, I live in DC now, 900 kids attempted the AP Computer Science exam, only about 200 women and 18 African Americans. So I spend a lot of time on that piece of the equation, but what's interesting to me is at our company, in terms of what we're looking for in the future workforce, programmer, engineer, like Abby said, lobbyist, it doesn't matter the position, you will be interviewed and scanned and reviewed for your ability to quickly respond and creatively articulate what could be. And so, for example, our engineers don't work in isolation of designers. They work in conjunction with designers. But even the coder or the programmer also has to be thinking in terms of the user and in terms of design. So I guess my whole advocacy point this morning is going to be around art not for the sake of arts education, but for the sake of getting kids to have the opportunity to exercise that part in the brain that gets them to create. Because frankly, the future of work and what I see in our workplace, that ability to create, no matter what the job is, as was stated earlier, that is going to be the higher paying job, the more fulfilling job, the job that is going to take us to these jobs that we can't even define. So creativity is baked into everything we do at my company. I just don't see it as separate.
Great. And before we move to Senator Sokola, and can I call you David for purposes of to David, we have a technical malfunction number 2, so we're just going to take a minute and make sure Allison gets her mic there so everybody can be sure to hear her in the rest of the conversation.
I can hold it. Okay.
And I don't know if you've read the senator's bio, but he actually is wearing 2 hats today. He, of course, is a state legislator in Delaware, but you are also a former business executive with DuPont.
Not an executive.
But formerly in the business arena, so he has 2 hats, but we're going to ask him to put on his policymaker hat for this framing question. David, how do you see policymakers tackling this question of the skills that are needed in the workforce to make policy, and yet how do they stay ahead of this question of, so what is the workplace of 10 years from now going to look like? How do policymakers tackle those things?
Right. So I actually go back to the 90s, the early 90s, and I've lived through Goals 2000, No Child Left Behind, and ESSA. And one of the things that Delaware did that I think is valuable, when we started establishing standards in the 90s as a response to Goals 2000, the emphasis, of course, was language arts, math, science, and social studies. But Delaware said, no, we're going to go beyond that, and we included the arts. And for each standards council, we included co-chairs from the education community, a teacher, as well as people from the business community or professionals in a field related. So the Arts Council could have had a musician or someone, but related to the professional end. But we go beyond that, and it's very important to go far beyond that. Each of them had as many stakeholders involved as we possibly could. You want parents, teachers, administrators, school board members, the businesses in the community that you're serving to each have input. Those meetings need to be open, transparent, and inclusive. And the other thing you need, though, is you need to come to an agreement ahead of time that you're not going to require a full consensus of everybody, because then somebody could be the barrier to making any progress. You want them to have input, but you want them to hear from others, and you want them to hear it in the context of the discussion that you're having. So I think it's important, if you want sustainability, to have that broad cross-section, but if you want to be looking forward, you don't establish standards and then the game's over. You have a periodic review, and of course sometimes those reviews are as a result of new laws, like after Goals 2000 when No Child Left Behind came in, and there became testing requirements for certain things. Well, okay, let's rethink about it and look at where we are. One of the things we had in Delaware, though, that I think was very important was we established in the early 90s an Academy of Performing Arts in the city of Wilmington. And throughout the entire process, you would hear from some teachers that now we have to teach to the test, or now we have to do this or that, and we're really constrained. And yet, year after year, we have an example in the city of Wilmington of a school that year after year was among the highest in academic growth. And if you went in and looked at that school and watched the classes, nobody would argue they were teaching to the test. They were learning math and science and social studies in an arts or performing arts context, and kids were applying what they were learning and retaining what they were learning. And that's why the academic growth was so good. And so when you have a story like that, the next obligation is to replicate it. And we haven't done as good a job at replicating it, but I do feel cautiously optimistic that some of what is going on now in Delaware is in that area that will really replicate it in a bigger scale, not the small little pockets that we've seen. I also, during that period, about a dozen years ago, served on the Education Commission State's Arts Commission that was established. And I was the vice chair. Vice chair is always a legislator, and the chair is always a governor. And the governor gets to pick the topic, and it was Mike Huckabee from Arkansas, and he played in a band. And he thought, his theme ought to be the arts, a lifetime of learning. And it was fascinating because And he liked to say, you know, the core subjects of math and science and social studies and language arts develop intellectual capital, but the arts develop creative capital. And that gets back to what you were saying earlier. You know, and people, even engineers, can sometimes be much more creative as a result of arts experience. And actually there's some patent evidence that shows that some of the unique things that people come up with have something to do with their experience relating to the arts.
Yeah, and I had the honor of being at some of those meetings of that commission special group one that Governor Huckabee chaired, and it really pushed the agenda of arts education forward to have that kind of focus at ECS on it, so it was very much appreciated.
The most fascinating thing about that experience, I had dinner one night in the governor's mansion, and there was a string quartet that was playing while we were eating, and it was kind of nice, background music and everything, but after dinner, each of them talked about their instrument, talked about its construction, talked about things like how its size related to the tone, and you know, it was fascinating because they were making applications of math and science to their instrument, and they had some fun. They had a fiddle fight. They, you know, I mean, there were things that were kind of cool that nobody left that dinner not wishing that you know, I played a string instrument when I was a kid, you know, and continued. It was fascinating, and I were you at that?
I think I was, because I remember that. And I thought about the times that I went to at Middletown High School and Myersville Elementary and so on, when the music teacher would have the spring recital or their concert, and they would never explain the standards behind what the kids were learning or how the science integrated into, and I just did the pieces and everybody applauded and went home. So yeah, it stuck with me because they took the time to show how these things are so integrated. Well, actually, what we want to do now, and then the communication that those kids were able to have to that audience brings us to two areas that we decided we would focus on, drill down a bit in the 4 C's. The first is communication, and then we're going to cover creativity as well. So let's look specifically at the question of communication, both inside and out of the workplace, but particularly in the workplace. I'm going in and out, is that okay? It's a vibrato effect from, in both inside and outside the workplace where communication is concerned, what can we expect because of social media and the use of these constantly evolving communication technologies? What kind of communications are we looking at for students in the future to have to be successful in the workplace?
That's me. So I'm not going to name specific vehicles for communication because, frankly, I can't predict where tweeting will take us or the next device will take us. But what I will do is say that the person who can synthesize quickly data and facts, the person who can articulate those data and facts in a usable, informational, engaging way, the person who can create informatics, so you know, digital visualization of whatever is happening in our society. All of those skills, those creative skills, the ability to assemble unique metaphors and ideas, again, to make it engaging, that is the communicator of the future. And I think the forms matter less than the ability to clearly think and to clearly articulate. It just so happens that I'm married to an editor of a magazine, and we're living through the death of print, right? And so, but what isn't dying ever, will never die, is the person who can do all the things that I just described. All of these things, I'm sure, are very familiar to you, but I think it's going to become heightened as time goes on, these skills, because obviously we can just quickly come up with data and information, but the person who's going to be highly paid and get the job is the person who can creatively communicate it.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up with David and ask, so we are always making the case that when it comes to communications, the arts have a unique contribution and so on. Can you name some ways that you see it in that school that you mentioned? how the arts specially equipped to give kids the communication skills for the future?
Well, it's whether you're a member of a marching band, a concert band, or a rock band, you're part of a team. And teammates have to work together, and they rely on each other. And so the kind of team-building skills that are essential for a band also have benefits in many businesses and industry and other areas. So that's kind of one real simple overview. You know, people always think of sports as team building, but here's another example where it's every bit as important to really do your presentation effectively.
Let me ask all three of you another part of this question on communications. Do you think the business community, let's focus on them for a moment, are aware of this role of the arts that we advocate about and we're talking about today? Is the business community generally aware of that? They name it, but do they know that the arts can be a special way of getting to those communication skills?
I can't speak to the business community at large. I just know the 35 or so organizations that we work with. Again, a couple of them are in the room. There's this overwhelming focus, not so much communication underlies everything, but the focus is on creativity. And I think they realize what everybody on the panel has been saying, that creativity is an integral part of innovation, and there's not an economy on earth that's not pushing innovation. And they know within their own business models that they have to be creative and they have to iterate constantly. And so I see more and more products and services in the education space being devoted to developing creativity.
Mm. Others?
I think it's very mixed. There are some businesses that are very aware of the value arts can add to the creative component, but there are some that have no clue, and that's just a simple answer.
And how about from you, Allison? With
I sit on the Microsoft Philanthropies team, so I can see what it is we fund, and especially in the state of Washington, where we're based in Redmond, we heavily fund the arts communities in all different kinds of activities. And then in addition, it's kind of interesting, we have one of the biggest collection of paintings that we also have a curator, and in all of our offices around the world, we have incredible artwork. And I can't tell you the number of times when we'll gather around a painting and, transition from a meeting to another meeting just to have a conversation that tends to be very abstract and analytical. And again, it's an expression, I think, of how we value the actual arts and the arts community.
Glad to hear that. So, Dave moved us to creativity as a segue. So, we have to recognize that the arts don't have a monopoly on creativity. Creativity exists in the other subject areas as well. But I think everyone would admit that the arts classroom is a great laboratory for creative development. Why is creativity, and you could expand a little bit on what you've already said, for each of you, why do you see creativity being so important to non-arts careers? And I know you're going to riff a little bit on some things you've already said, but I want to have you have that opportunity, these non-arts careers and creativity, and we know that the arts can get kids to that point.
Well, one of the things I like about my job is that I do a significant amount of international travel, and I've been working closely with Asian countries for 5 years now. And I look at what Singapore's done with their Ministry of Education and a focus on creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship. Worked in Korea for 3 years now, and they see the connection between innovation and entrepreneurship. And we are just launching, top secret, don't tell anybody, P21 China in a couple of weeks. And the focus there is on creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship as well. So when I look at what these fast developing economies or old mainline manufacturing economies view as the future of work, it helps me understand what I think the United States has to do and how the United States has to change its educational system. So if they clearly see, and I learn from them, that connection between arts, creativity, innovation, and the next step is entrepreneurship as a driver of economy, then we need to get on the ball.
Others?
So last month, there was an eclipse that across the continental United States. And in the build up to that and in the promotion about it, there were a lot of stories about historical events around eclipses, and one of them that came up quite a bit was the one in 1919, known as Einstein's eclipse, because it basically established one core element of relativity. And the interesting thing, Einstein said, a society's competitive advantage will come not from how well its schools teach the multiplication and periodic tables, but from how well they stimulate imagination and creativity. He was well known for playing his violin at times when his research kind of hit a barrier, kind of hit a wall. And it has been said that music was not so much an escape as it was a connection to the harmony underlying the universe. He was awed both in music and in physics by the beauty of harmonies. It was no mere diversion, it helped him think. And so that I thought those were relevant items when I was going through some stuff preparing for this, and I wanted to share those.
Absolutely.
Well,
Allison?
I guess that I'd say one of the most exciting things I get to do is go to Microsoft Research, and I'll walk into this massive building and a robot will greet me, and I'll get to see all the things that we talk about in the news, like they all come alive. And right in the lobby area, we have interactive artists to get people thinking outside the box right there in that moment. And in terms of non-arts careers, again, it's hard for me to distinguish. I don't delineate the creative people over here and the non-creative people over here, and the best way to give you is to give you an example. So like what these researchers do is they get together in these multidisciplinary teams and they try to solve a massive problem. So let me give you a specific problem. So one is seasonal affective disorder, and we all know that light therapy has really helped people, right? Address the needs of that disorder. And so some of the research scientists having to do with light and new ways to deliver light have been designing, how do we have wearables with these lights embedded in the wearables so that people, so the big problem is that when people walk away from their light lamp, or their, I don't know exactly what they're called, the lamps, they start to feel depressed again, right? And so, this is all within a big bucket of health and research and all this, right? But guess who's working with them to solve that particular issue? It's the designer. She came up with a shawl. She came up with a scarf. And they found these ways to embed these little lights into this beautiful scarf that you would actually want to purchase and wear, right? I mean, regardless. And so the engineers and the light developers are talking with the designer, but they all have to be thinking about what could be rather than what is. And collectively, they're all being creative. So non-arts careers or arts careers, to me, it's hard for me to delineate between all of them.
Thank you. You made me reflect back on years ago, we got a group of folks together from each of the disciplines, and we, at the Arts Endowment at that time, we were defining design as its own discipline for purposes of just trying to understand what kids would want to know and be able to do. And it was interesting, we had somebody from the engineering field in this focus group, and I remember distinctly, Allison, he talked about the solution after next. So it's not the solution you're looking for immediately, it's the one after next. So it's the idea that the designer comes in and thinks about, well, the solution is something that people are going to actually want to wear as opposed to something that will do a certain technical function. So yeah, that stayed with me from that engineer and that discussion. Any others on this element of creativity? All right, I want to move to, I mentioned that with Every Student Succeeds Act, which goes into effect fully this school year, we have that well-rounded education. Music and the arts, as I mentioned, are part of the definition of it, along with any other subjects that state and local school districts want to add. But that's a challenge for many school systems around the country. Why? Because they have limited time and resources. Why is it important for those school districts to meet that challenge of a well-rounded education in terms of the future workforce, and that well-rounded including music and the arts? Why is that important? Anybody? David?
I think the well-rounded part involves a whole lot more than business and everything. It also involves things like quality of life. And I don't know how many people in here might have thought what I thought when Abby said she nailed it. And she said it with pride in her voice, and you could tell that she was so happy that she had done it. And what I came back to is when Susan Boyle sang I Dreamed a Dream in front of an audience that in the beginning was everywhere from laughing at her to ridiculing her. And, you know, because the camera was going around, if you saw that YouTube, and people had their thumbs down and were chuckling and everything. And 3 minutes later, they were in love with her. And she nailed it. And she knew she nailed it. And, you know, so her quality of life, you know, she already could sing. She knew she could sing. And she was confident in being able to do it. She was able to step up and nail it. And I think that's part of well-rounded, when you have quality of life because of your experiences and how you apply those experiences. So.
Dave?
One of the things I feel comfortable talking about is what actually occurs in the classroom. I taught middle school for 6 years in an inner city LA school, and then I taught high school in Northern California. So I very much understand the time constraints on teachers. And one of the false dichotomies or straw man arguments that's befuddled this field, meaning 21st century skills for a long time, is this belief that you teach content in a silo, and if you have time, you teach skills in a silo. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The analogy I always use to explain the relationship between the two and the teaching of the two is the DNA double helix. The DNA molecule cannot exist in a single strand. It has to have both strands running in a double helix. That's the way you use art to teach skills, to teach content. That's the way you use history to teach skills, to teach content. They have to be interrelated. So the argument that I do not have time to do art, or argument that I do not have time to teach collaboration or creativity, is a mistaken assumption. The assumption should be the curricular design should do both in that spiral.
Others on this?
I mean, I totally understand that if school districts struggle to figure out and articulate, and states as well, how to get at this idea of the well-rounded student, given all the constraints and all the things that come at them. All I can say from a business perspective is the way that I'm reviewed is not simply by how I do my job, you know, day to day. It's how well I seriously am a good person. I mean, they don't put that on my review, are you a good person? However, they do ask questions like, you know, you have these 360-degree reviews. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, where you send out to all these different divisions the way they review my work, but they really review how well I work with everybody, right? It isn't the output, it's the process that we all go through. And they have very specific questions about the way that I relate to people, the way that I deal with ambiguity, the way that I creatively solve an interpersonal dynamic that's a problem. So getting at this well-rounded student, to me, is definitely needed, because one day they're going to want to be a well-rounded employee.
And the other side of this question is, so what are the implications for kids not being well-rounded in the future? What's that going to look like for our workforce? I know it's a softball question, but I want to make sure we've teased out both the positive and what could be the negative if people are not paying attention to a well-rounded that includes music and the arts.
One of my concerns relates to how we sort of embody the principles that are in our framework. And so there are 79 exemplar schools and early learning networks around the United States that go through this rigorous application process to become an exemplar. And then we can take business leaders or policymakers to them and say, this is what it looks like in a physical instantiation. And some of those reviews, when we do on-site, and I try to do as many of them myself as possible, don't go as well. And having taught in an inner city school, I feel comfortable saying this, is in some inner city schools, the focus is still on rote learning in knowledge. And skills are secondary or an add-on or never occur. So what I'm hoping that occurs through ESSA and the focus on socio-emotional learning and well-rounded education is less of an emphasis on how well every kid does on one standardized assessment. I think it's going to take us a significant amount of time to transition them, but I think it's an equity resource issue that we haven't solved.
I want to expand on what you just said about the inner city schools things, because I had a privilege of visiting a few schools as part of that Arts Commission. And there were schools that were established in cities that were arts academies that when we talk to kids, who said, you know, I used to miss school a lot, but now I feel like I have a reason to go to school. And so it's important that you not just stick to that rote learning that you mentioned, but you have that well-rounded opportunity, because they have an opportunity not only to apply math, science, and social studies, and language arts, but they have to learn it in what can be a fun circumstance.
Yeah. And I agree, I've seen those schools as well, and art is often a lever. Like in Minneapolis, there's a school for recording arts. In San Diego, there's High Tech High. So one of our schools is right on the border of Mexico. 99% of the kids are Latino and English is their second language, and they have a VAPA academy. So they're using art to engage these kids and draw them into school.
Yeah, you see attendance go up, you see academic performance go up, and you see quality of life go up. That's a win-win-win.
Allison?
I guess the way that what I'm concerned about, so your question was about what would happen if we don't have these well-rounded people in our society, right? I'm worried about that, but I'm also worried about if the students don't even understand that they're gaining these competencies. So it's like this whole idea of metacognition. Are we asking kids to think about their thinking, right? So they might be in arts education and not even know what it is that they're gaining in terms of the higher order way of thinking, or they might be in math or interdisciplinary or whatever. So let me just give you one quick story. So Sophie, Katie, and Sam, all super smart kids. I got asked a year ago at this time to do a professional development seminar for about 350 K-12 teachers on what's needed in the workforce, higher order thinking, how do we infuse it into our lessons. So I asked these three they were seniors at the time, they're all in college now. One is at Yale, one is at Swarthmore, and one is at Michigan, right? So these are the smart kids, right? So I sat down with these three students and I said, look, I need you to help me conduct this professional development seminar. And they were like, okay. I mean, they knew me for other reasons. I work with their club, I mentor their club. And I said, what I want you to do is I want you to single out one teacher from K-12, your seniors, that has asked you, I showed them Bloom's taxonomy, I showed them the creative part of the triangle, right? Like where you actually have to use your muscle to think of something new. I said, I want you to think of one lesson plan from one teacher that you're gonna highlight where you were asked to create something. And they're like, oh, you mean in symphony? And I'm like, no, it doesn't have to be. Well, you mean, and this is what's scary. I mean, these three students were going, they're ultimately in these great colleges, right? Which is great, and they'll probably be great employees, but they literally struggled to, I wasn't sure if they didn't have teachers that had asked them to do that, which I had a hard time believing that was true, or if they couldn't think about their thinking and when they had experienced it. And so we spent a lot of time identifying a specific teacher and a lesson plan. And then when they got it, they started to see all kinds of connections with other parts of their learning. And then they could articulate that higher order thinking in a much clearer way than they had before that exercise. So getting kids to think about what it is you're gifting them or you're advocating for them, I think just about is as important as doing it. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, any others on this? Actually, one of the questions from the audience we actually thought of ahead of time, so great minds think alike. We want to turn the attention now to this question of meeting this challenge that ESSA has given us about a well-rounded education that includes music and the arts. So how do we go about convincing the policymakers and the corporate leaders that in fact this is true and they should act on it in rolling out ESSA? What advice can each of you give to our audience today about making that case to state and local education leaders and to business leaders? And by the way, the question from the audience is a bit of an acknowledgement that we've been making this case for 20 years and it hasn't stuck. So with ESSA, how can we better make the case and make it stick? David, can we start with you?
Again, in order to make things stick, I think you need a broad cross-section of stakeholders involved and kind of singing from the same hymnal when we are talking to the business and professional community. And it helps if you have examples like our School for Performing Arts that has a terrific academic record. I became aware this year of a guitar building project. I don't know how many of you have heard of that, but it's from the National Science Foundation, and one of the national arts groups established it. And teachers come together over the summer in a learning project, and they build electric guitars, and they work, and they do a great job. But they have they also engage in student-centered learning activities that relate to the guitar design, specific math, science, and engineering topics related to that, and how it works and why it makes sense. And when I saw that, it reminded me of that thing in the governor's mansion with the string quartet, because by being able to relate what you're doing that has to do with the arts to other things that have application to the business world, I think kids are going to be much more likely to retain a lesson and then apply that lesson that they retained in a creative manner, because you learn it, I think, in more depth when you learn it that way.
Thank you. Allison or Dave? Either one?
I mean, there's, so I do this. I mean, we all go and lobby in different ways, right? And there's the tactical approach. I mean, it's important, right? Who are you speaking to? What resonates for that person? Knowing exactly what it is you're going to say, the data points you're going to use, and really having your homework done before you even walk in that office is, you know, for me at least, it's 60% of the battle. But your questions about both policymakers and the business community, I do think finding ways to make the case that arts education, it can be found in all education, and that arts education is this really high-end vehicle to get kids to that higher order thinking, which are the higher paying jobs of the future, and that they understand what it is that's happening to them when they're going through it. Clearly articulating that to a policymaker or a business person, you may do this already, I don't know, I think is really critical.
In our conversation last week, you mentioned the concept of a trigger question. Can you explain that a little bit? When I captured trigger. I think you were saying at the beginning there, but when you go in, know what kind of question would get the interest of the corporate person you're talking to?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't remember saying the word trigger, but I do. I mean, I have found new ways to break through to lawmakers. And one of the ways that I do it, to give away one of my secrets, I guess, is I actually bring students with me now. And I don't, we're launching a youth advocacy toolkit. You're welcome to take a look at it if you'd like. And this is seriously because I found that lawmakers, especially governors, would respond to the messages in a completely different way, not because they thought, oh, you're such a cute kid, which is not, frankly, what we're all after, right, when you're delivering your message. It's when the kid actually looks at the lawmaker and has an argument, has some data, takes themselves seriously, takes the context seriously, and then this happened right in front of me. A student looked at a governor and said, you know, can we count on you? And it was kind of a showstopper. No, it was a showstopper. They were supposed to go in for 15 minutes. We were there for an hour and a half. He ended up featuring these students in his State of the State address. They all got a standing applause, and he created a new task force, blah, blah, blah. All things, as a person who does this for almost full time, I didn't predict that was going to happen. And these students also found their voice. And so it's not just bringing the student as a prop, not that you would do that, or to make everyone feel good inside. It's really taking them in the context seriously and up-leveling everybody's game. But then for the student to look at the lawmaker and say that, it was a poignant moment that got results.
Yeah, I was thinking, Allison, listening to Abby, I thought, we got to take her on the road. You know? This is like, she's so articulate at that age about the influence of the arts on her career development, which she hasn't even entered into yet, but more her character development and how poised she was in front of all of us. So the last question, we only have a few minutes. This came from the audience. I think it's a great one. So it's a little bit of putting you on the spot. Can you talk about one skill you learned through the arts and how it directly applies to your everyday work?
Nope, just kidding. I'm just kidding. Sorry, I had to do that. Go ahead. You guys go first.
Well,
David?
I travel a great deal, and I think the iPad is the greatest invention in the history of the world, and for a variety of reasons. And I have 6 drawing apps on my iPad, and I am the least skilled artist in the history of the world, but I absolutely love to draw. And then sometimes the flight attendants will see me drawing, and they'll try to sneak behind me and see what the heck I'm drawing. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so horrible, don't look at it. But I love to draw, and I learned something about myself is, I mentioned earlier this iterative process. And I run a business, and we produce a budget, and it goes through about 47 different changes before it becomes the actual budget. And a strategic plan goes through 172 changes before it becomes. And so when I draw on airplanes or at home, and I have charcoal at home, and again, this stuff is really bad, but I love to do it. And so to me, that mimics the iterative process that I have to do with budgets and strategic plans.
Very good. David?
So I'll just kind of go back to something I mentioned earlier. If you're a member of a band or a marching band, you're a part of a team. And I feel like I've always been a good team member in all of my employment opportunities over the years. And I was also in athletics, but I gotta believe that the band experience also helped develop those team skills.
Okay, but were you in the marching band?
Yes.
Yeah, the thing that I remember is I could never march and play at the same time. But then there were a number of us who could not do that simultaneously because whenever we were marching, it was very soft. And then when we got to formation, making the H and the P for high point, then the music just swelled. So it wasn't just me. So Allison, you get the last word on this. An art skill that you learned that you're using every day?
I think my choir teacher, she opened every class with 5 minutes of some piece of music that, of course, none of us would have picked, right? It was like everything worldwide. And I do remember being surprised, in class, like, whoa, I like that, but I don't know why I like that. And this sort of diversity, and I just remember sometimes being almost confused by it, and some of us after class would talk about a piece or something that we had heard, and we would, sometimes, it was strange. It was almost like we were a little bit uncomfortable, whatever, but somehow in the process of it, we got comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I have to say, like right now at my company, I've been in there almost 13 years, and I'm saying this in all sincerity, I've never had the same job year to year. I mean, every year it's like, oh, I'm working on the future of work and AI, or you know what I mean? Like, it's like, and so feeling comfortable with being uncomfortable is something maybe the arts gives us to transform, to help us get to that higher level, and that's helped me.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you and ask for a round of applause for our panelists.
Oh, thanks, you too. I was a little unsure about
And
this
before,
art.
just before we go, if we could stay for just a minute, I want to take a personal privilege to introduce the Arts and Education team at the U.S. Department of Education. Like the Arts Education Partnership team, as Jane said yesterday, they're small but mighty. We are the same at the Department of Education. Can I ask our colleagues to stand up? Bonnie Carter. Bonnie is team lead, which means she takes care of all the important things like the grant competition management and so on. Ashley McBride. Ashley is a program officer with us. Right over there. Ashley, stand up. Come on. And finally, I want a round of applause for all three. Veronica Edwards is our third program officer. Veronica. One commercial announcement. People have been asking, so when are we going to announce the grants? It will be this month. We're going to be announcing the grantees in the professional development for arts educators category this month. We'll do it before September 30th, I promise you, so watch for that from us. Thank you, everybody. This was wonderful. Thank you all especially.